Biology 12 has always been known as a lecture-based course. Forever. You know, I think on the outlines it always says, this is a lecture-based course. It's nice to have a new medium in order to not be standing at the front the whole entire 80 minutes, every single class, lecturing. At some points, you're gonna check out because you can't listen to one person for that entire time.
So flipped classroom, basically, we would watch podcasts before we went to class, and we would learn the material ahead of time so that when we went to class every day, we had more time to apply the learning in labs and assignments that we did in class. And I think that's a lot better because we have time to actually learn the material and see how it's applied in the real world rather than just learning it and not really understanding why we're learning it.
It's basically where you're taking the lecture part of the classroom and moving it to homework. Students will actually be getting the lesson content at home, and then anything that they would have been doing at home, they'll be doing in class.
Students kind of get a quick sneak peek of the content, and then they really start to explore it more in class. And with that exploration, that's where the teacher can go around and individually help all the students, or they can go in and probe for further questions so that they can dig a little bit deeper and get to those higher order thinking type of questions compared to if the teacher was just standing in the front of the classroom and giving all the content at all the times. The classroom becomes much more of a student-centered environment rather than a teacher-centered environment. And when I don't have to necessarily worry about the presentation of the material every single day, I get to spend so much more time with the kids.
You can get to know the students a lot better and have more of a personalized kind of relationship with them rather than just being up at the front constantly lecturing, because then that really is a division between you and the student.
It looked a lot different than a normal classroom as the lab benches are in pods, so there was a lot more social time to discuss what we learned with our friends. And often we would sit around our lab benches at the beginning of class and we would pull out some whiteboards and whiteboard markers and we would do questions from the board or like an assignment on what we learned the night before, and then we got a chance to discuss it in class. Sometimes we would come in and do a lab right away, and that would also help with our learning. It was just a lot more flexible in class and a lot more social time to discuss what we learned.
Sometimes when we tell them we're giving them something different, we're offering them, you know, education in a different way, it kind of throws them a little bit at first. There was one student at the beginning of this year who started to panic. And then she came back and said at the end of the year, I'm so glad I stuck with this. Was the best way she could have learned. We want to be able to offer the material in a way that's going to suit every student's learning manner. We find that this sort of environment really increases their engagement because they can't sit and be passive learners in class. They have to actively engage in order to actually learn the content. This shifts the responsibility of the learning to the student rather than being the learning on the teacher. Our tool, what we used, was we created what we call vodcasts. And so these were video lessons that we would create at home. It didn't have us in the picture, but it had our voices.
Podcast worked really well for me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. Because you can go back and look at everything.
And I definitely preferred it over notes so that you can kind of see what's happening.
Because like you can still like write it down when you're doing a podcast and stuff too. So like if you
Yeah,
are
and
like
you
a
can
note taker,
stop
then
the
exactly
lesson
that's
in case
exactly.
it's going too fast for you.
You can't like press pause on the teacher.
Yeah.
So oh, wait.
Yeah. Too far.
Even when coming to study for the final exam, if there was a certain area in which they didn't understand, they get to re-watch that lecture because the material already exists for them.
If they hadn't watched the podcast, then they'd have other members there that could explain it to them, and then actually teaching somebody something helps them retain it.
For me, this classroom obviously was the best science class that I've ever had because I really had a chance to apply the learning that I did, and I found it much more interesting to go to class rather than going into class every day and having an hour-long lecture.
It's definitely a shift for the students, which at the beginning, it does take a bit of time for them to adjust to this new way because they do have to take some responsibility about actively engaging when they get there to do the check-in, to do the lab, to do whatever it might be. Their learning builds your lesson the next day. So yes, that would require that you would have to look at that material before class, but you know where to start because your kids have given you direct feedback on where you should be starting the next day. Your lesson plan isn't guiding your kids are guiding your lesson plan. So it really allows you to focus on what the needs of the students actually are.